Ooh, fancy.
That was fancy. Sorry, that voice comes out of nowhere.
No, I thought it was going to be like some big person interrupting or something. So to get you started, we are actually going to put you all into breakout groups. And for the breakout group, if you are comfortable to put your video on, that is best so that we can see the faces of the individuals speaking. And really, we just want to have you all engage in about a 5-minute discussion to start thinking about what are some of those challenges that you see LGBTQ youth facing. And what experience do you have supporting queer youth, supporting youth in the LGBTQ community? So we will go ahead and put you into breakout rooms for 5 minutes. And then when we come back, we will hear out from some of you as well.
And there's no wrong answer.
All right. I'll be putting people in the breakout rooms right now for 5 minutes.
Awesome.
Thank you. Sweet. Did y'all want to join a breakout room or no?
We'll let them talk first and then.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Just that like clip.
So can you can't really walk around, can you?
No, I'm non-weight bearing, potentially
Oh,
for
shit.
6 weeks. That's
36 weeks?
6 weeks.
Oh, it's like,
36 weeks. I just like leave work and go
nah.
to the beach. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, 6 weeks is what we're anticipating. We go back to the doctor in a week. So non-weight bearing they had to fix my ACL and my meniscus, and the meniscus is the curveball because they like just repair it. So that's where we're at. That's where we're at.
Hey, Jesse, I'm gonna throw you into a room right now, man.
James, what does your wife do?
She is a costume designer for TV.
Oh, that's amazing.
That's cool.
Yeah. But hasn't been working, obviously, for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you get into that? Fashion design?
Yeah, fashion. So started in fashion design. Like she was at Evergreen. She studied well, this is funny because this is a while ago. I think it was called Oriental Design.
Wow.
Yeah. So she was doing no theater and things like that. And then we met in grad school in 2000. Okay. And then she got her MFA in costume design. And then basically it's just knowing people. You join the union, the whole nine. So she's worked pretty much full time as a costume designer since leaving grad school.
Okay.
Then we moved here and then was trying to find work, and then COVID hit. And then, yeah, now she's not helping. She's mothering our children.
Yeah.
Helping mother.
Yeah, she's mom. She's mom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I don't know where she is now.
I could see how presenting together would face a challenge.
Well, it's funny. I was an actor. She was a costume designer. Not once did we work together for 20 years. I did Law and Order. She did Law and Order, but we never worked together. I did Rescue Me. She did Rescue Me. Never worked together. We never worked. It was the strangest thing. Even when I directed a play, I was like, I'll call someone else to design the costumes. Children. You want to say hi to Aytch and Tovah?
Nope. Kids.
Okay, that was River.
We have our 17-year-old.
Yeah, we're getting did I tell you that we're getting a 17-year-old in August?
What? Is this a transfer student, right?
Yeah, a kid from Vietnam.
Vietnam. That's awesome. How long are they staying here?
In his room.
A whole year.
Whole year. Oh, holy moly. Wow.
Yeah.
Are you ready for that?
As ready as we'll ever be. The room is set up and we've discussed how we'll have the tough conversations, and
Yeah.
We'll go from there.
Yeah.
I mean, he'll be 17 and a half by the time he gets here, just about.
Cool. Yeah.
So like, it's, you know, he's going to be pretty independent also, which is,
yeah.
Wants to play sports and do stuff, which is what we want. We want a social youth.
Yeah, no doubt. Will they be at university?
No, they'll be at the high school.
Okay.
By us. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Which will almost be a joke for him because he's in a gifted school at Vietnam. So, you know, the gifted school at Vietnam is probably harder than the AP classes here. So like the school thing is just like a formality for him to have this experience.
Right.
Thank God, because I don't know any AP like trigonometry or calculus. Like, sorry, dude, you're on your own for that one. But I don't think school is going to be like an issue for him here.
No, not at all.
I think we can close the rooms.
And close them out?
Yeah.
Cool. People should be jumping back in.
Perfect.
All right.
30 seconds.
Can people do chat or in the?
We'll have them unmute.
Unmute.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back. Looks like we're waiting for a couple more people. All right, looks like the rooms are closed. So welcome back, everybody. If some of you wouldn't mind going ahead and unmuting yourself and sharing what was your discussion in your breakout room. What types of challenges are you seeing, and what is this experience you have or others have in terms of supporting queer youth? But not everybody all at once.
Don't be shy.
I think in our group, a lot of it boiled down to cultural struggles, like things like shorthand, you know, usually straight students being like, oh, that's so gay, things like that. And the other thing that came up was trust building as adults in their life. How do you create a culture of trust so that they can come out to you, that they can talk to you about what they're facing?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Rowan. For the individuals in Rowan's breakout group, you are all in the right place because we are going to be talking about that, specifically about what does trust building look like for our queer population of youth, because it is different than, it is different supporting and building relationships and really harnessing those relationships for the gender diverse population. Anybody else want to share out?
One thing that was brought up in my group was through COVID, it was a little bit different for them because where kids could go to support groups at school, when COVID locked down everything, they didn't have those places to go.
Yeah, and each can speak to that a little bit, for sure.
Yes, you know, sometimes like our LGBTQ community, sometimes the only safe spaces are those places that you mentioned to go, and being pulled during COVID has, you know, affected everybody with their mental health, but really has affected queer and gender diverse youth because they may not be safe at home. They may not have other people to reach out to. That has definitely been a hot topic the last year. That's correct.
Yeah, some of the work that we do is behavioral supports for youth impacted by suicidal ideations, by significant trauma, by homicidal ideations. And with COVID, the Mary Bridge Children's Hospital, their behavioral health unit saw an increase of 400%. So youth ages 7 to 17.
Yeah.
An increase from the year before COVID to this COVID year, an increase of 400% for youth experiencing primarily suicidal ideations. So we know that COVID is significantly impacting that that social community, right? That connection that kids have. Anybody else?
We had two different ideas on what type of challenges. And for me, the challenges was just having a sense of belonging. Was that we are in such a small community, and our community doesn't really accept differences as well, and any differences. And so that was just kind of my feeling on it, is that even if we're working on being a more inclusive community, but even if we get there, there's still there's still that sense of belonging. And so we're going towards that. But there's like a lack of resources, even just to find clothing or to find a good barber or anything, it's hard to have any of those resources and feel like that you belong here.
Yeah, and Natalia, we at the end of this, you'll have access to our email. Between myself and Aytch, we have so many resources. Queer only barbers, right? People, yeah, with Aytch goes, those. Yeah, right. Clothing banks. Aytch's Gender Health Clinic has a binding bank for individuals that need binders, right? So there are resources out there, and it's hard to find them. So please feel free. You can always reach out to us for access to those resources. All right, we will continue. So we want to start with just what we know the research tells us about mentoring, right? Endless studies show us that additional support for the queer community, specifically queer youth, is helpful and needed, right? There is a positive impact in terms specifically when queer youth have role models that they can identify with and mentors. And one of the reasons for this is because the most recent data on LGBTQ youth shows us that transgender and gender diverse individuals reported very high statistics, specifically in grades K-12 on harassment. Almost 80% of gender diverse youth experienced verbal harassment while at school. 35% experienced physical assault, and 12% experience sexual violence, right? These numbers are much higher than youth who are not gender diverse in a school system, right? About 15% experience harassment so severe they actually had to leave school. And we know that statistically, when an individual is transgender or gender diverse, they experience higher harassment and disrespect and violence from police officers, as well as inappropriate or non-equal treatment by judges and court officials. I support and work in the foster system in Pierce County, and there's a much higher percentage of transgender youth that are in foster care simply because they are transgender and their families have kicked them out.
And if we're talking about these statistics are only for transgender or gender diverse. So if you think about broadening that spectrum to all LGBTQ plus youth, those numbers get even higher, because then we're talking about, gay and bisexual and other identities, not just trans. So we can see there's a big need for bigger supports out there.
Yeah. So we're going to move into understanding and talking a little bit about gender identity. So please go ahead and in the chat, just put in your best guess of how old do you think we are when we have a stable sense of our gender identity. So again, when we're talking about gender identity, we want to be careful. We're not talking about what society tells us that gender identity is or what our gender identity is, but when in our head do we have a good idea of what gender we identify with? Wow, we have like a pretty smart group here. Yeah.
We're getting a lot of 4s, 5s, 3s, 2 to 4s.
Yep. Awesome, thank you. So this is what we know about gender identity. The first thing is that gender identity is self-identified, right? No matter how many gender reveals we have out there, it's not about what our parents or what the doctors tell us about our gender identity. It's how we determine and define our own gender. By age 2, children actually become conscious of the physical differences between boys and girls, right? We're talking about genitalia specifically. By age 3, most children can easily label themselves as a boy or a girl, and they become conscious of societal roles, right? So they become conscious of, if you're a little boy, you get trucks to play with. If you're a little girl, you get Barbies, right? These common societal norms that we have set up specifically in our society. And by age 4, right, age 4 to 5, by kindergarten typically, most children will have a strong and stable sense of their gender identity. Now, why we see that youth start coming out older, right, 10, 11, 12, 13, is because of the gender dysphoria that they may experience during while hormones are changing, as well as the societal norms that have put on them based on what their parents and what society tell them they are in terms of their gender identity. And also, to just reiterate in terms of sexual orientation, many youth who identify as non-heterosexual do report an increase in unhealthy and maladaptive behaviors as an attempt to cope with stressors related to their identity and gender affiliation and their sense of being socially invisible. So this is why, statistically, when we work with and engage with adolescents and teenagers who either do not identify as heterosexual and maybe are questioning or are trying to determine their own gender identity in a area or in a society that they will have challenges with, they can move to and they can engage in inappropriate or unhealthy behaviors, drug use, as well, to cope with what they're feeling, cope with their experiences. So as we know, especially for adolescents, this is a crucial identity development period, right? This is when they are starting to understand and define who they are as an individual. And they're also becoming more aware that they are different from their societal norms, right? They start to begin and explore into that awareness. What does that mean? What does that look like from them? And this is when they need and they start to look for support from others. Who are adults they can look up to? Who are adults they can lean on, they can support, right? Aytch has stories over and over again about young adolescents, right, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds, that when they find out that Aytch is an adult, they think Aytch is like elderly at this point.
Yeah.
And Aytch uses they, them pronouns. They're like, you use they, them pronouns too, and you're a professional. Like they become so elated that there's another human being out there that uses pronouns that they identify with, right? This is when they learn to navigate and they start to share their difference as part of being in what our society would identify them as a marginalized group. We're going to go into trauma in the brain specifically. And so I just want to reiterate that when we're talking about trauma, we're specifically talking about a response to a negative external event or a series event which surpasses the youth's ordinary coping skills. The youth is not able to cope. They don't have the skills yet. So I'm going to break down how trauma affects and impacts the brain. I will give you all a disclaimer. I am not a science teacher, right? There's much more to this, but I'm going to make it as easy as possible for all of us to understand. We know that we have the reptilian brain, right? This is that part in the back of our brain that is our fight, flight, or freeze. When we are experiencing high stress or high trauma or chronic stress, that is when our reptilian brain kicks in, right? And we have this fight, flight, or freeze response depending on how we want to survive and how are we going to survive. We then have the limbic system. The limbic system starts to fire the most as we enter adolescence, at 10, 11, 12 years of age. This is responsible for our emotions, right? Our feelings. What's important to note is that when we are having that limbic system triggering or firing quite a bit, when we are in a high emotion situation, our communication part of the brain actually shuts down. And this is why so frequently, if you work with adolescents, you know, when they are in a high emotional state, they can have a hard time communicating, right? Same with us as adults too. If we are in a high emotional state, our communication does shut down. And then we have the neocortex. And specifically, I'm going to talk about this prefrontal cortex, or the prefrontal lobes, right? This part of the brain is responsible for our thinking, for our being able to be rational, making appropriate choices, right? Knowing what is good or what is wrong. What's important to note is that our prefrontal lobes do not fully develop until we are in our mid-20s. Right, 25 to 27 is when our prefrontal lobes are done developing. Now, for men, the newest research says that it actually doesn't fully develop until mid to late 50s. I'm just kidding about that. That's not true. There's no such thing as a men and women brain. H knows I just love that joke. But no, everybody's prefrontal lobes, if it is developing appropriately, should be fully developed by the mid to late 20s. The only way for our prefrontal lobes to develop is if we are triggering them and if we are firing those lobes, right? If we as adults are giving youth right or wrong questions, if we're helping youth problem solve, if we're getting youth to think about rational decisions to make, okay? When we are in our reptilian brain, our prefrontal lobes completely shut off. Our prefrontal lobes do not fire when we are living in survival mode. And this can mean that our prefrontal lobes may never fully develop if we don't get those supports and change and adapt and modify what our environment is so that we are out of this traumatic situation or out of this chronic stress. Working with trans youth and gender diverse youth, there's a variety of ways of times and instances where they are living in their reptilian brain, where they're living in their survival brain. We know being misgendered is huge. When they are misgendered, they are triggered, right? They are living in their survival brain. How do I get out of this situation so I stop being misgendered? Dead naming. When individuals ask what their name was before, right? Or when individuals call them the name that they do not want to be called, right? This happens to H all the time.
Yeah. I used to just use the letter H and people would say, but what's your real name? And I said, yeah, H is my real name. And they were shocked how that could be a real name.
Some comments are, a mother would never name a child H, right? That's a real life comment from a person that didn't think that they were doing any harm, right? Using the wrong pronouns. Assault and abuse. There's a much higher increase of assault and abuse for gender diverse individuals. And no access to affirming healthcare. And H is going to go into some statistics about that as well.
Okay, so we're going to go into a little bit of a data before we go into some approaches to mentoring this population. So the Trevor Project, for those of you who do not know, is a nationally known organization and is a leading organization in helping LGBTQ plus youth in crisis management. They're amazing. They have a crisis line, a text line, a chat line, a call line. I think even now they have a virtual line. And every year they do this survey on LGBTQ youth mental health, and they have released their 2020 study. If you go to their website, you can see all of this data. We think that it's getting better, and in some instances it is, but this data will show us different, unfortunately. So this was done with 40,000 participants, and we'll go through this as mental health, right? So nearly half of transgender and non-binary youth did not receive mental health care due to their own concerns that the therapist would not have competency. That is almost 20,000 youth who are not seeking mental health care due to the fact they're worried that their provider is going to not know, what their identity means. And that is very, very real. I come across that a lot in our clinic, or they're afraid to go to therapy, or they've had a therapist that's like, what do you mean? You're not a boy. You don't play sports, so you can't be a boy. So it's really traumatizing to go to those therapy and providers. So this is also, 46% of LGBTQ youth respondents reported they wanted psychological emotional counseling, but they were unable to receive it in the past 12 months. So these are youth who want to do it, but there's either A, not providers, B, the providers are not competent, or in some cases, their parents do not think that this is real, this is not serious, and they just don't take them. And that's almost 50% of youth who want counseling can't get it. We can see why mental health is increasing. And then this is just kind of overall statistics about housing stability. If we have housing stability, we all know that we're more likely to succeed. And like Tovah mentioned earlier, youth who are trans or non-binary have a staggering amount higher number and percentage of being kicked out of their home, maybe even running away from their home because they're not being validated or they're being abused. And then where are they going? Sometimes it's foster care, sometimes it's on the streets. And that is a higher percentage compared to their cisgender peers who could also be in the LGBTQ community, but this is specifically for trans and gender nonconforming youth.
Yeah, you can see the increase from the left. This is LGBTQ youth as a whole, and then on the right, it jumps by almost 10% transgender and non-binary youth.
So we just want to kind of go back to the chat and just put a word, a phrase, a sentence, anything that you feel comfortable with, kind of with these stats that we've given you. Sometimes they can be, I think, alarming and kind of heartbreaking of where we're at. So we just kind of want to like take a minute to reflect on that.
Reality.
Yeah, reality is a good one.
Yeah, not surprising.
Yeah, you know, Pride Month is coming up, and it's, you know, it's great that Pride Month exists. And I think sometimes people who aren't ingrained in this work are like, things are so much better. Same-sex marriage is legal, all this stuff. But when you get down to the nitty-gritty, I mean, if we look at the South, right? There's Arkansas, my job is now a felony. Those youth can't get care because it's criminal, and other states are following that. So we think we've come a really long way, but have we really is the question.
Aytch just mentioned Arkansas. Tennessee just passed a law that if you are a business owner that will allow transgender individuals into your building, you have to now put a sign in your window saying that.
Although the district attorney said he will not prosecute like those businesses for not doing that. So he did have a little moral, but just think that's even just, you know, that is so archaic,
Yeah.
right? We're still there.
Yeah.
So, and those families have to, you know, there's a lot of stories about families leaving Arkansas with their trans youth, and that is heartbreaking. You have to leave because your state can't support you. So these are just kind of some of those reflection and why mentoring and continuing educating yourself is so important with this population. It's always changing and growing. Yeah. Angry is also a really good word.
So we'll go into a little bit some of the mentoring studies that have been out that you can research and read about specifically for lesbian and gay youth. There really hasn't been much. I will put that out there. There has not been a ton of studies specifically for transgender in particular. And as you can see, this study back from 2005 is specific for lesbian and gay youth. What the research tells us is nothing surprising. There are benefits if we get gender diverse and queer individuals, right, and lesbian, gay youth, a mentor, right, a role model. The benefits include increased well-being, improvement as a college student, right, a commitment to give back to the community. And a huge thing that's really important to know is that mentors actually play a really big role in helping mentees unlearn stereotypes about who they are, about their identity, because there are a lot of stereotypes about the LGBTQ community. And so really, and this is a picture, if you can point out myself and Aytch, you get extra,
Waldo?
Yeah, you get extra credit. This is a picture back from, I think, 2013, when Aytch and I put together this Gay Straight Alliance group with a whole bunch of high school students. Some of the high school students look older than us, and put together this first ever gender neutral bathroom, which we are all standing in. Mentoring impacts our youth, right? We know that. And our youth need mentors, especially our gender diverse youth, need mentors of individuals that will hear them, that will validate them, that will support them based on their needs. We look so serious. I wish I could smile on that photo.
No, the seriousness was like we're
We're
here,
cool.
we're queer, we did this. Yeah, we need more. That was
I'll just tell you one quick thing. One of the kids we actually were interviewed by the Seattle Times, and her quote that was like all over the Seattle Times was like, just let us pee in peace.
Yeah.
Like, that's all we want. So this is what it looks like, right? This is what it tells us why mentoring is so critical, right? It's that social support for kiddos, emotional support, informational support, right? So many youth, so many gender diverse youth have questions when they show up to Aytch's gender clinic that we would think, why would a kid ask that? But it's because they have nobody else to ask. They don't know who to turn to, who to go to. Even that self-appraisal, right? Having self-efficacy, having self-confidence, and of course, unconditional support, knowing that you are their mentor, you are an adult that will support them and will not kick them out, will not move them, into a different adult or into a different classroom or into a different place, a learning environment.
consistency.
Mm-hmm. And relationships are huge. Relationships play a huge part in building this trust and supports with youth. In 2019, the Trevor Project stated that having one supportive adult decreases suicide attempts among LGBTQ youth by 40%. That is huge, right? And it's important to note that the Trevor Project stated that the majority of these adults were outside of the home. That could be any one of you in this training today that is just there, that is a strong adult in a youth life. Dr. Bruce Perry, who does a lot of research on neurobiological diversity with youth and trauma and the brain, states that there is no more effective neurobiological intervention than that of a safe relationship. Building relationships with kids, right? That's what it's all about. And Zaretta Hammond, author of Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, states that the foundation of being culturally responsive is not technical, it is relational, right? Aytch and I can do these trainings all day, every day, but it's really about you all being there, supporting these kids, validating who they are. That's going to make the difference, right? It's about that authentic caring.
And if we know anything about teens, they know when you're not being authentic, and they will tell you. If you are being fake with them, they know it. A lot of my teens are like, oh, you're a social worker, right? I have tattoos and piercings and a mohawk, and I just am real with them and realistic. And they're like, nobody has been like this and just authentic. I'm like, and you build their trust that way. And if you're not, they know it. Yeah, they will know it fast.
But just for the record, you don't need a mohawk to have teens like you.
It helps. Okay, so we're gonna go into some skills. So we're gonna break this down in 3 categories, and we will go through it. So micro, meso, and macro, and that's a social work practice. See?
Yeah, people love mohawks.
Jesse, yeah. Okay. Next. So the 3 areas of social work. So macro, right, is when you're looking and working towards large scale systematic change. So that's laws, that's activism, that's funding communities. This is big social policy change. And then you take it down to meso, which is more working with groups and organizations. So schools, drop-in centers, hospitals, nonprofits, small community work. And then micro is one-on-one, right? So mentoring is one-on-one. That's when you're working with individuals or families. Oftentimes you can think of that as therapist counseling. So we're going to kind of adapt the micro, meso, macro social work practice and how you can do that as a mentor. So we'll start with the micro skills. So micro, when we're thinking one-on-one, right, with that youth. So the three big ones for micro skills with our youth are validate, assure, and ask. So when we talk about validating, thank you for telling me. You feel honored that they're, trust you enough to tell you that information. You might be the first person they tell, or you might be the 1,000th person, but it doesn't matter. Still honoring that you feel, privileged to be a part of that journey is super validating for them. And then assure them, let them tell you how they need your support. We don't want to assume the support that they need. So ask them, how can I support you? What do you need from me? How can I, if somebody misgenders you, who can I correct? That way you know what their boundaries are and what they do and do not want you to do. This is really important with trans and gender diverse youth, specifically with names and pronouns. They might not be out to everybody with their names and pronouns. So if you correct somebody that they're not out to, that could be a big that could be a safety thing. So having those conversations. Same thing with our non-heterosexual youth, right? They might not be out as gay or any other sexual orientation to other people. So we have to be aware of navigating that dynamic with them. And then ask, like, who else knows? I'm glad you have such a strong support system. You know, how can I help you navigate this? Ask them what they need so we're not assuming. And that's really like micro, one-on-one, what you can do right with the youth, not only just in that moment when you're talking to them, but also like throughout your relationship with them. So then we'll go to macro. I thought it was meso, but we'll go right to the macro. There we go. Okay. Meso. So meso is that middle ground, right? So we're talking about community as an agency. So if a youth comes out to you, right, and wants to talk with their family about their identity, whatever that may be, how can you support that, right? So now you're going to support them with their family system. So some of those things can be like, you know, have them writing it down. Have they practiced it? Can you do role playing and conversation, and role play the good and the bad reactions, right? If a youth is unsure what their parents are going to say, help them prep of what they're going to do. If a parent or a caregiver is not supportive, what's their safety plan, right? And having those conversations is really helpful, because it's really scary just looking your caregivers in the eyes and saying, by the way, you know, that can be very traumatizing if it doesn't go well. Again, at school, right? If they're not out at school and they want to come out at school, how can you help them do that, right? Help them identify safe supports, right? That's a conversation I have. Well, who is a teacher, a counselor, a principal, a social worker at your school, one person that you feel safe with? Talk to them and they will help you navigate the rest, right? So how can they navigate that school dynamic? That's a big one for LGBTQ youth on many different levels. And then kind of even broadening it wider, right? Who are their safe people? Who are the agencies where they live, right? If they can't go to a drop-in group immediately, if they're not, you know, in a city, what are the virtual supports that exist? The positive thing about COVID is these virtual support groups are not going away, right? They're going to stay. So how can they get connected with that? Who else is a safe person if it's not their family? What friends do they have? And really looking at navigating the organizations and systems in their life to have that support. The more support they have, the better they will be mentally and the more they will succeed. And then macro, right? So how can we support them in a large scale? And that I think is kind of hard to adapt the macro skills when we're talking about one-on-one work, but like acknowledge them how they want to be acknowledged, right? If they want to use a different name every time you see them, great, do it, right? If they want to use different pronouns, just roll with it, right? They might be experimenting with you. If you're taking them someplace or they're coming in maybe to see you for like a conversation one-on-one, what does your environment look like, right? What are your safe zones, signs, right? Rainbow flags, HRC, which is the Human Rights Campaign equality sign. A good one that's like kind of up to date with the youth is, you know, Schitt's Creek, right? That it was such a big thing last year. You know, David on Schitt's Creek really brought out that identity in a small town. Also, I don't know if you all know much about Pose, but Pose is about Black and brown trans woman back, I think like in the 80s, 70s, 90s, about their journey, right, as trans women and that community. Also, there's posters of that, and that's a really hot series right now. I would suggest it if you haven't seen it. So how are we signaling that we're supporting them on a bigger level, right? It's one thing to say, I support you and I'll use your name, but what are we doing large scale, not just in that moment? Make sure you use an inclusive language, right? So even earlier I said parents and I corrected myself to caregivers, right? Parents is very heteronormative, sometimes very cis in our society. So caregivers, right? Using just language that is not binary and that is welcoming to them is really important. We're going to go a little bit deeper into what to avoid, but the big ones are, you know, gender expression does not equate to sexual orientation. So how somebody expresses themselves does not mean it reflects their sexual orientation, and that gender identity and sexual orientation does not relate to maladaptive sexual behaviors. That's a big stigma in the community, right? Especially like if you're a gay male, right? The stigma is you're very sexually active and you're out all the time. And those are the type of stigmas we want to break down. So, understand the confidentiality with the youth. How can you support them in confidentiality in schools, families, and the larger system? Again, having that conversation. Really just being transparent with them is the best way to connect, and they will tell you what you need. These youth are very vocal about what they need, and they know what they don't need.
Yeah, and Robin put that I didn't know that the term parents was binary. I think the important thing, Robin, with parents is that a lot of our gender diverse youth may not be living with their birth parents, right? And so just being inclusive, that they may have caregivers, foster parents. So using a term like caregivers is more inclusive.
Grandparents.
Yeah, grandparents. Yeah.
Oh, next slide. Yeah, more macro skills. I didn't realize we switched. So some other macro skills are work on their strengths, right? What are their strengths, and play into those strengths. A lot of times these youth are always told what their strengths aren't or what they are not. Play into what they are, right? They're so creative and they're so kind and they're so loving and they have a lot to give. They just need to know what their strengths are, especially if they can't pull that out of themselves. Help them understand coping skills, help them understand problem solving skills, right? How do they navigate these things?
And putting that back, if once we start promoting this and helping them, that puts them back into that prefrontal cortex to really develop those rational thinking, that rational thinking brain.
Yep. And the big one, macro, right? Names, pronouns, and expressions. Like I said, a lot of these teens, teens are breaking down all the boxes. They don't specifically girl and boy boxes. Our generation, like below us, our teens and youth, do not care about that anymore, right? They don't want to be labeled like that. And they might express differently, right? If a boy wants to wear a dress, great, right? There's no big deal about this. And they're breaking those boxes down. So understand that you might see a large spectrum of different expression and identities. And be a good role model, like with your colleagues, right? If you hear a colleague misgendering somebody and it's okay to correct them, remind them, right? Educate them on these things. A quick reminder, like, oh, that person uses he, him pronouns. It doesn't have to be big deal, but that's how you be an allyship on a bigger level. It's what we do when the person we're supporting isn't right next to us. Yeah, let's roll them through. Okay. So some things, don't assume that the youth you're working with are heterosexual binary, right? Don't just assume because they look straight or they look like a girl or they look like a boy that they are. Ask, hey, what pronouns do you use? Ask right when you meet them. Introduce yourself by saying, I'm Aytch, I use they, them pronouns. What pronouns do you use? Great. And if they are heterosexual and very like boy and want to live in the boy box, that's fine too, right? That is okay. But just knowing this is a norm that we do is very, very helpful. Again, use that inclusive language. Caregivers, right? Don't use boys and girls. Just, people, youth. A lot with teens, I try to avoid them calling them like kids. I call them youth or like young adults because they are youth or young adults. They're not little kids. Be aware of your own biases and attitudes, right? Unconscious bias, right? I think a lot of people are working on dismantling those. And the same thing comes with our gender diverse youth and our LGBTQ youth. Knowing what your biases are will help you unravel them. And if you catch yourself, right, if you misgender youth, oh, sorry, I meant he, and move on, right? We don't have to make it a big deal. And again, this is a population that the terms and the expression and all of it with the teens is constantly changing. Yeah. There is no competence in this area. It is ever growing. I hear new terms all the time, and all I do is work with teens and kids, little kids, and I'll say, what does that mean? And I'm like, okay, that's a new one, right? Pronouns are ever evolving. So really keeping up with things is going to be crucial in building this type of relationship with this population. And then, right, like on the last slide, attend conferences, attend training. Some of it might be repeat, some of it might not be, right? So educating yourself, we cannot rely on our youth or LGBTQ plus population to educate us. You know, there's a lot of good resources at the end that exist. There's bad research and there's good research. So understanding which one's right and which one's not is also very helpful. Ask questions to your colleagues, ask questions to the teen, ask questions in here. That's why we're here. The more you ask, the more you know. I think this topic, misgendering and pronouns and names, can be a hot topic, and I think a lot of people don't want to mess up, so they just don't do anything at all. But that is an act of silence, and that is actually can be more harmful.
Yeah. You want to respond to Brandy? So Brandy in the chat said that I've heard that asking for pronouns might make people feel like they have to out themselves and they may not be ready and comfortable in certain settings. Thoughts here? So I think, Brandy, the first thing is that we never just want to ask somebody a pronoun without introducing our own pronouns, right? That's the first step. And so you would say, hi, my name's Brandy. I use she, her pronouns. And you, right? So you would ask them, and that opens up the conversation where if they want to engage in that discussion and tell you their pronouns, then they will do so.
Yeah, and that's also like even a larger scale, right? Like in here, we're like, oh, put your pronouns if you want. When I do some trainings at Multicare, I encourage people to put their pronouns, and if you're not comfortable, that's okay too. We don't want to make it a mandate by any means. A lot of the times, if there's trans people in the workplace that aren't ready to come out, they just won't put anything, and that's okay too. I think more of like our cis, I'll speak from a gender diverse person perspective. When I see a cis ally that has their pronouns in their email, I'm like, okay, you at least get that pronouns are important. A lot of times too, as an ally, right? If you have your pronouns in your email or your business card or your badge, whatever it is, people who don't care about pronouns won't really notice it, but people even like myself who pronouns are so important and so close to my heart and these youth will notice it, like, oh hey, I notice your pronouns, right? And it will make a difference to somebody.
Yeah.
But again, never force anybody to say a pronoun if they don't want to, and that's okay too, right? And over time, as you build that relationship, then they may feel comfortable, like, by the way, I use they, them pronouns, or whatever pronouns they use. That is part of that trust building. Yeah. That's a good question though.
And Megan, we have a bunch of resources at the end for you. Unfortunately, there is no like vocab that's coming up every single day with all the new and ever-changing language. But the resources, we're learning.
Teenagers.
Yeah.
Ask the teens.
We're learning as well about some of the new language. But the resources at the end you will have access to, and that's the best online resource that you can have.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we're going to kind of talk about what not to do, right? So these are the skills to do. And there's also things we want to avoid. So we want to assume that their life is hard, or that they want what?
Avoid assuming.
Yeah, avoid assuming that their life is hard, or that they want to have their gender or sexuality the focus of your support with them, right? Gender might not be a thing. They may have been out since they're 4, and that doesn't need to be the focus, right? So we want to ask, like, is this something you want support with? It may be somebody coming out to you the first time, or they may have been out their whole lives, and that is so far in the past. That's not the focus. So we don't want to focus on that if they don't want the focus to be on that. And that's really important. A lot of times these youth will go to therapy, and automatically therapists will assume that's what they want to focus on. So some other quick things to avoid. Phrases, right? How can you be sure you're gay? Really? You're trans? Oh, have you really thought about this? How do you know it's not a phase? It seems like your life will be so much harder. I will tell you, nobody chooses to lead a harder life. People just want to live their authentic life. Don't critique them, right? Don't be cautious of their criticism, of your own criticism regarding their outness, right? If they're not out to their family or not out to their school, there's a reason for that, and just respect it, right? And again, back to those stereotypes, sexual activity, expression, who they've told, why they've told people. There's a reason for those things, and they know those reasons. And just some quick overview of what to, kind of think about is, LGBTQ plus youth have a lot of internalized fear and stigma on themselves of homophobia, transphobia due to what society tells us, right? And what they see in the world. So no, they have a lot of internal fear about themselves. Coming out is a continuous process. Every time, they have to say their pronouns, they're coming out. They might have to answer about their name. That is more than just, hey, I'm gay, or hey, I'm trans and want to use these names. It is a constant lifelong process, and be aware of how much energy that takes for people. You don't know who the other people in their life are and how they will react when they come out. So we don't want to push them to come out if they're not ready. They face more unique challenges in the world as far as relationships, sex ed, right? Sex ed is boys and girls. They don't talk about if you're trans and what that looks like. And they often hear a lot of negative rhetoric in our society, from family, from school, from peers, online. So just keep in mind, they navigate a lot of different things that our cis and hetero normative peers do not.
And really quickly, before we go into a Q&A, there's a great way to do an organizational assessment. So wherever you work and the individuals that you support, you can start thinking based on these questions. What are the policies for accepting LGBTQ mentors and mentees, right? What does that look like? How inclusive is it, right? Even just thinking about the language of big brothers, big sisters, right? That is not inclusive language for gender diverse youth. Has discussion been had about accepting gender diverse mentors and mentees? What does that look like? Do you have gender diverse individuals that you work with who are mentors for the younger generation? Are LGBTQ individuals listed as people that you welcome and serve in your organization? Do staff orientations, staff trainings cover how to support queer individuals? And then are queer materials, LGBTQ plus materials, visible in your organization? Right, I used to work for one of the largest districts in Washington State, and every single bathroom was gendered. It was either men's or women's bathroom in all of the district offices, which means that if H were ever to have come visit me, they would not have felt comfortable themselves just even using the bathrooms because they were gendered. So what are some materials that are visible, and does it feel welcoming to individuals that may not be cisgender or heteronormative?
We have about 5 minutes for questions. So any questions you all have, you can drop them in the chat and we are more than welcome to field those. And then we're going to share some resources as well in just a few minutes.
Yeah, or feel free to unmute yourself as well if that's quicker.
Hi, I have a question.
All right, sure.
I think for me, I come from a family that's LGBTQIA plus and allies, but I still get, just because I'm not surrounded with that kind of culture, I still get very nervous when I present these kind of things at our club, because I'm afraid I'm going to do something wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's, regardless of what box you think you check in, there's no box. Everyone's different. There's no two people alike. And so I might do something that I think is the right thing to do, but it might be the wrong thing to do. So I live on that fear. What is the way that I can overcome that fear?
Well, I would say, Natalia, I probably experience that more than H when I am doing conferences or supporting school districts with gender diverse youth, because I do not identify as a gender diverse individual. I am a cis woman. And so I think part of it is also being humble, like recognizing that, I probably am going to make mistakes along the way, and that's okay. I am still learning. H said earlier that this isn't about having LGBTQ competency. It's really about having LGBTQ humility, knowing that this is a lifelong process. Things are ever changing. Using the word queer now was not okay even 10 years ago. Right? Things are constantly changing, and that's okay. And you are learning alongside all of us, right? So I think the more having conversations about it, the more easier it is, and the more safer I feel about being an ally and being confident in the knowledge that I have, knowing that there's still more knowledge for me to have as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. H is just an expert in all things gender identity, so I knew that they wouldn't know how to answer that.
I have a interesting question, I think. So I'm a queer person and I work with other queer adults and young adults. And so we do a lot of work around queer joy and like creating these really vibrant spaces. But the trick that we've always run into is translating that back out into the real world in a way that is like inviting and accessible and not further othering in more cis spaces, if that makes sense.
As in a way of like, how can you translate that queer joy in that space? And then when they leave there, it's like, oh, now I feel empty for them.
A little bit that too. And then like it's really easy to feel tokened or othered or like the unicorn in the room when you're trying to take your queer joy back out into the real world.
Yes. Yes. I think I think a lot of our youth that I work with too, a lot of them go to the Oasis Youth Center right here in Tacoma, and they love it there and they feel like they can be so free. But right, like you do that in a area that's like is very cis or is very like straight, and it's kind of like, oh, why do you have to be so gay, or why do you have to always talk about your gender, right? And that is so real. And but I think that like makes the argument that like having those safe spaces is so important because they are so sacred to us, especially if you're somebody who feels they need to express those. I think that's why we have those safe spaces.
Well, and I think one of the reasons why I love that question, Rowan, is because for the individuals that are in this PD right now, that are cis individuals, heterosexual individuals that are working with queer youth, it's important to know that you all may have some biases around that, right? Like why, just like what H was saying, for individuals, for youth that have to be closeted, there's just as many individuals that are super out and proud, and let them be out and proud, right? Engage in dialogue with them. I think it's really important for cis individuals to make sure that we are, again, like validating and acknowledging queer youth for their joy.
Yeah, if they want to wear a trans flag, great. Not for me, but if a youth wants to like wear it as a cape, do it, right? Be happy about who you are. And that's what it's about. And doing it safely. Let's talk about safety.
All right, I know we're pretty much done. We have a couple more questions. These are the list of resources, and I believe, James, does everybody have access to our slides?
If you send them to me, then yes.
Okay. Yeah. And I think I sent them
to Laura.
Perfect. But this is our, for any questions that you did not get answered today, feel free to email us. We are always available for trainings. We do full day, half day trainings for organizations and companies. We're happy to do that and support you all. So yeah, thank you so much. This is great.
Yeah, and if you have a queer, questioning, gender diverse youth that needs medical care, Google Marybridge Gender Clinic. It talks about how to get in, and we are here for them. We serve youth all over the state.
Can you flip back to that other slide real quick?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we have the Trevor Project, which I mentioned earlier, Gender Odyssey, which does a great 4-day conference in San Diego, all different tracks. Gender Spectrum has a lot of support groups for youth, caregivers, all sorts of people. Then it has my clinic's information, the Marybridge Gender Clinic. Seattle Children also have a gender clinic. It's the two of us. Ingersoll has a lot of resources about like language and staying up to date. And PFLAG is a great resource for parents or mentors that want to learn more and attend meetings and even do one-on-one work. PFLAG is one in almost every county. So they're an amazing resource. And if you check out the Seattle Gender Clinic website or mine, there's like 10 times this amount of resources. There's readings, there's podcasts, there's webinars, there's all sorts of stuff on my website as well from the Gender Clinic at Marybridge. So I would highly suggest checking that out.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question real quick. Where would I find resources like the binder bank?
Me. You can email me. Yep.
Sure,
If a
what's
youth
your,
needs them.
Denaro at multicare.org.
Yep. And we can talk about how to do. Yep. How to get connected that way.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tovah and Aytch. This was
Thank
an
you.
amazing presentation. Enough respect. Air horns. We talked about West Indian food this morning, so air horns.
And thank you all for being engaged. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your sessions today.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
y'all.
Youth panels in 2 minutes. Awesome.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.